Well, hello, and welcome to the next in our series of Bible studies through Luke's Gospel. Today we're looking at Luke chapter 6, and we're looking at verses 37 to 42. So if you want to grab a Bible and follow along, I'm going to read the passage. So Luke 6, 37 to 42. Well, in fact, I'll start in verse 36. So Luke 6, 36. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you'll not be judged. Do not condemn, and you'll not be condemned. Forgive, and you'll be forgiven. Give, and it'll be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your eye, then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So some perhaps well-known words there, and they very much repeat similar themes to the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew's Gospel. So this is from Luke's Gospel. Remember, this can sometimes be called the Sermon on the Plain. So let's see if we can work out what's going on here. Remember, they're in that part of this passage, a teaching section from Jesus. And I began in verse 36, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. So one thing we need to do as Christians is copy our Father by being merciful like he is merciful. And then Jesus sort of lays this out to us. So first of all, verse 37, do not judge and you'll not be judged. Do not condemn and you'll not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Now, these verses are often quoted today, especially do not judge and you'll not be judged. That if we see someone doing something morally wrong, they'll often say, well, don't judge. The Bible says you shouldn't judge. What does Jesus actually mean here by judgment? He's not saying suspend all moral judgments, don't have discernment, don't offer any evaluation. What he's condemning here is what you might call a judgmental spirit. Remember, if we're copying a merciful God, then we should have mercy. So rather than be judgmental with others, having a judgmental spirit, we're called to be merciful towards them. So this isn't a call to suspend our critical faculties. This is a call not to be judgmental. Remember, the people who were judgmental at the time, the religious leaders, the Pharisees. We know later in Luke's Gospel, we're going to get to the prayer of the Pharisee, who thanks God he's not like as bad as those other people over there. That's to have a judgmental spirit, the Pharisees. And they were people who condemned people. They were people who struggled with the idea of forgiving others. And Jesus comes along and says, have a spirit of mercy like your Father's merciful. Don't have a judgmental spirit. Don't have a spirit of condemnation towards others, but actually have a spirit of forgiveness. Why? Because the Father is merciful. The Father forgives. So we're called to be recreated in his likeness by being people of mercy, people of forgiveness, which means not being judgmental or condemnatory towards others. And so this is a call about having the right spirit. And in fact, the illustration that's given, verse 38, is about having a generous spirit, generosity. Give and it'll be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. Now, I'm told one of the things they used to do back in Bible times is if you bought something at a market, a certain measure of grain, they'd often measure out the grain literally into your garment, into your lap. That was how things were measured out if you didn't have a container. So literally poured into your lap. So this is saying, be generous because God is generous. Be merciful because God is merciful. Forgive because God forgives. So have the same spirit that God has. And then he reinforces it again with a parable, verse 39, where we get the expression, the blind leading the blind. If you've got two blind people, will not the blind leader pull both of them into a pit? We need to be careful about who we follow. So this is a special call to watch out for the spiritual leaders we might be following. Because if our spiritual leader is blind, then they're going to take us in the same wrong direction in which they're going. So again, Jesus, the time he's speaking, is particularly talking about the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, who he describes here as spiritually blind and leading others in the same wrong direction. But this also could be equally applied today. Who spiritually wise do we listen to? Which teachers do we listen to? If you go on the internet, there's all kinds of weird and wonderful preachers and teachers on the internet. How do you know who to listen to? It's very difficult to discern on the internet because you don't know the lives of the leaders. You don't know what kind of life they're actually leading. Are they living a life that backs up the teaching that they're given or not? And so it's always important. Jesus is going to get to this very shortly when he talks about the fruit of the trees in the next section. How it's important to look at the fruit of somebody, not just perhaps what they're saying. Are they living it out? Because remember, Jesus is the ultimate example here. Not only does he tell us, if you like, what to do, he lived it out in his own life. Jesus was someone who was merciful towards those that persecuted him. He didn't judge. Remember when his disciples at one point asked him to call down fire from heaven on unbelieving towns, and Jesus refuses to do that. He doesn't condemn other than bad spiritual teachers. Those are the people he does condemn. Jesus forgives. Jesus is generous. And so Jesus models the teaching that he's actually given. But the spiritual teachers of the time in Jesus' day were not modeling the teaching they were given. They were, in Jesus' words, hypocrites. Now, remember, back in those days, a hypocrite was someone who wore a mask. So if they were in a play and they were different, they changed their character, they switched their mask over. They literally changed their mask. That was the hypocrite who wears the mask, who might be teaching one thing, but actually doing another. Remember what Jesus calls the Pharisees. They were like whitewashed tombs, great on the outside, but absolutely spiritually dead on the inside. So this is Jesus' warning. Verse 40, the student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. So the question is, well, if we're going to be like our teacher spiritually, who is teaching us? Obviously, the ultimate teacher is Jesus. And so the best person to learn from is Jesus himself by reading the Bible and listening to Jesus' words and looking for those teachers on the internet or otherwise that teach about Jesus, but also can back it up with the lives that they live. They're actually living out the teaching of Jesus in their own lives. And then Jesus again moves on to another famous illustration here about the sawdust and the plank. I remember when I used to work at a Christian organisation once, and the sort of the in joke was when someone got something in their eye, say, what's stuck in your eye? And someone else would say, oh, they've got a plank stuck in their eye. Jesus uses a very sort of humorous and memorable illustration here to say, look, don't look at the problem in your brother's eye, i.e. your fellow Christian. Don't look at them and go, tut, 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 condemning spirit, that kind of thing, looking at them when you don't see the plank in your own eye. You're looking at the small fault that they might have, but do you see actually the big fault that you've got yourself? So before we start looking at other people, condemning them spiritually, looking down on other people, is to look inside our own heart, our own soul, and judge our own spirit, and to see that actually look at our own sins first before we start trying to condemn, judge the sins of others. Someone once put it this way: is if you point the finger at somebody, you'll see there's one finger pointing at them, but there's four fingers pointing back at yourself. I should say three fingers and a thumb pointing back at yourself. If we're going to, Jesus says, look, if you are going to condemn somebody, be careful, because the standard that you use will be used upon yourself. So remember, he's criticizing here the Pharisees and the teachers of the law because they were very condemnatory people. Thank God we're not like these other naughty people over here, these wicked tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, etc. They look down on these other these other people, well, they actually didn't recognize that those very sins that they were condemning in others were actually present in their own hearts. They were, if you like, picking out the sawdust and not seeing the plank in their own eyes, their own hypocrisy. So Jesus is pointing this out to them. So he's talking about Christians. He's not talking about looking at the world, probably the non-Christian world, and going, look how naughty these people are. Look at how wicked and sinful these people are. This is within the church. Look at your brother's eye. He's talking about how you teach your brother, which is the person, your fellow Christian. So be careful. So first take the plank out of your own eye, then you'll see clearly. You have to deal with your own sins first. Overcome your own sins before you start talking about other people's. So these are wise words for us even today, and not to have a condemnatory spirit, not to be judgmental upon others within the church, not to be the tutters on the back row, if you like, but to be like God, to be people of mercy, to be people of forgiveness, to be people of generosity, and to follow teachers that not only teach this, but also live it out themselves. So I hope you'll come and join me for the next episode where we look at we follow up by looking at the fruit and the trees, looking at the fruit of people's lives to see whether what they're actually teaching is the right thing.